Imagine you're sitting in a forest in Tanzania. It's 1974. The air smells like wet earth and fruit. And then, from somewhere nearby, you hear screaming. Not the kind of screaming that fades quickly, the kind that goes on, raw and desperate, until it suddenly stops. A researcher named Jane Goodall was in that forest, and what she witnessed over the next 4 years would shatter everything scientists thought they knew about the animals closest to us on the tree of life. It would ignite a debate that rages in biology, anthropology, and philosophy to this very day. A debate that cuts right to the heart of one of the oldest and most uncomfortable questions in all of human history. Are we, as a species, born to make war? Most people, when they think about that question, think about history books. They think about generals and empires and weapons. They think about the 20th century with its world wars and its genocides. But the answer, or at least a piece of it, might not lie in our history books at all. It might lie in the behavior of a group of chimpanzees who tore themselves apart in the forests of Gombe National Park over 50 years ago. Today, we're going on a journey that starts in Africa and ends inside the human mind. We're going to ask what violence really is, where it comes from, and whether anything in our biology makes it inevitable. And along the way, we're going to meet some of the most fascinating, most disturbing, and most heartbreaking animal behavior ever documented by science. Stay with me, because by the end of this, the way you think about human nature may never quite be the same. Before we talk about chimpanzees specifically, we need to lay some groundwork, because when scientists talk about violence having biological roots, people sometimes hear something that they find deeply uncomfortable. They hear, violence is natural, therefore violence is unavoidable, therefore nothing we do about it really matters. And that is a misunderstanding of what biology actually says. Biology is not destiny. Let's be very clear about that from the start. The fact that a behavior has evolutionary roots does not make it good, does not make it inevitable, and does not excuse it morally. Lots of things that are completely natural are also things we work very hard to prevent. Disease is natural. Infant mortality is natural. We don't throw our hands up and say, well, it's in our biology, so what can we do? But understanding where a behavior comes from, really understanding it at a deep mechanistic level, is actually one of the most powerful tools we have for changing it. And that is why the biology of violence matters, not because it gives us an excuse, but because it gives us a map. So where does violence live in the brain? Neuroscientists have spent decades trying to answer that question, and the picture that has emerged is considerably more complex than the old idea of a simple aggression center buried somewhere in our skulls. Violence, it turns out, is not a single thing. It is a family of behaviors, each with its own neural signature, its own evolutionary history, and its own relationship to the social environment. There is what researchers call reactive aggression. This is the hot, impulsive kind, the kind that happens when you feel threatened, when you're cornered, when something or someone triggers a rapid fear response, and your body acts before your conscious mind can intervene. Reactive aggression is deeply ancient. It is present in virtually every vertebrate animal with a nervous system complex enough to produce it. The amygdala, that small almond-shaped structure deep in your temporal lobe, is one of the key players here. It processes threats rapidly, often before the information has even fully reached your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for deliberate, considered decision-making. In moments of reactive aggression, the amygdala is essentially running the show. Then there is what researchers call proactive aggression. This is the cold, calculated kind, the kind that involves planning, coordination, delayed gratification, and a kind of strategic thinking, the kind that looks, from the outside, disturbingly like warfare. Proactive aggression requires the prefrontal cortex to stay engaged rather than being overridden. It requires the ability to suppress immediate emotional responses and execute a plan. It requires, in a word, cognition. And this is where things get genuinely interesting when we talk about chimpanzees, because proactive aggression of the kind that we see in chimps requires cognitive abilities that most animals simply do not possess. A 2016 paper in the journal Nature, led by primatologist Michael Wilson, analyzed data from 18 chimpanzee study sites across Africa and found that lethal aggression in chimps is best predicted not by human disturbance or ecological stress, but by adaptive factors. Specifically, by things like having more males in the group and the availability of safe opportunities to attack. In other words, chimps don't kill because they're under unusual stress. They kill when it makes strategic sense, when the odds are in their favor. That is proactive aggression. That is planning. And it is, when you sit with it for a moment, more than a little unsettling. But here's the question that really drives the scientific debate. Is proactive aggression something that evolved independently in humans and chimpanzees, or did we both inherit it from a common ancestor who was already capable of this kind of strategic violence? Because the answer to that question has enormous implications for how we think about human nature. To understand what the Gombe-Chimpanzee War actually tells us, we need to understand it not just as a sequence of violent events, but as a story about social structure, about what holds a community together, and about what happens when those bonds fracture. The chimpanzees of Gombe's Kasekela community were not strangers to each other. These were animals that had grown up together, groomed each other, shared food, formed alliances, navigated complex political relationships across years and even decades of shared life. The males that would eventually hunt down and kill their former companions had known those companions since birth in some cases. This is not analogous to two rival gangs in adjacent territories. This is more like a civil war, the collapse of a community from within. And the mechanism of that collapse is deeply instructive. What researchers piece together, going back through years of careful behavioral records, is that the fracture began not with a single dramatic event, but with a gradual, almost imperceptible accumulation of social tension. The death or displacement of an alpha creates a power vacuum. A power vacuum generates competition. Competition generates factions. And factions, if the underlying group is large enough and stressed enough, can eventually pull a community apart entirely. The chimpanzee social structure, that fission-fusion system, where the larger community breaks into smaller foraging groups that come back together, is actually both a strength and a vulnerability. It is a strength because it allows the community to exploit food resources efficiently across a large territory, with different subgroups searching different areas simultaneously. But it is a vulnerability because it means that subsets of the group are regularly spending extended periods away from the main body of the community. And if those subsets begin to develop their own internal cohesion, their own social bonds that are stronger than their bonds to the wider group, the seeds of a split are planted. This is exactly what happened with the males who would become the Kahama group. They were not, researchers now believe, always a separate group that had temporarily merged with Kasekela for the sake of convenience. The evidence from Goliath alone makes that interpretation difficult to sustain, since he had literally been the alpha of the Kasekela community before the split. What happened instead was that a set of social relationships within Kasekela began to reorganize around a different center of gravity. The brothers Charlie and Hugh, frustrated by their inability to dislodge Humphrey from the alpha position, began spending more and more time with each other and with a small cluster of other males and females. Their social world contracted, their investment in the broader community diminished, and at some point a threshold was crossed, and the group that had been Kasekela became two groups, Kasekela and Kahama, with everything that followed from that transformation. What makes this so significant from a scientific perspective is that this kind of fission event is, by the genetic evidence, extraordinarily rare. Studies using Y chromosome data to reconstruct the founding dates of chimpanzee communities found that the youngest communities in the sample were around 125 years old, and the oldest were over 2,000 years old. These communities are ancient, stable structures. They don't just casually split apart. When they do, something has gone seriously, unusually wrong. And understanding what went seriously wrong at Gombe requires us to think about the intersection of two kinds of stress that were converging on the community at the same time. There was the political stress of an unresolved dominance hierarchy, the absence of an alpha that the whole community recognized and submitted to, and there was the reproductive stress of a heavily male-skewed sex ratio, with most of the females in the community either too old, too young, or currently nursing and therefore not sexually available. When you combine political instability with resource scarcity, in this case the reproductive resource of available females, you create conditions where individual males have very strong incentives to defect, to pursue strategies that might be individually advantageous even if they are catastrophic for the group as a whole. This is a pattern that appears, in different forms, across many social species, and it is a pattern that students of human history will find deeply, uncomfortably familiar. The Gombe-Chimpanzee War reignited a debate in anthropology and evolutionary biology that had been simmering for decades, and that debate centers on a deceptively simple question. Is war ancient or is it modern? Did our ancestors, the early members of the genus Homo, wage war? Did the even earlier hominins who preceded them? Does the capacity for organized, lethal, proactive violence against members of our own species go all the way back to the ancestor we share with chimpanzees, somewhere between 6 and 8 million years ago? On one side of this debate, you have what is sometimes called the deep roots hypothesis. Proponents of this view argue that the behavioral parallels between chimpanzee intergroup violence and human warfare are too striking to be coincidental. Both species form patrols of predominantly male adults that seek out and attack members of neighboring groups when the odds are heavily in their favor. Both species show a strong preference for attacking isolated individuals rather than engaging groups of similar size. Both species, when they successfully eliminate a neighboring group, expand into that group's former territory. These similarities, in this view, are not accidents. They reflect shared evolutionary ancestry. We and chimpanzees inherited the psychological and behavioral machinery for intergroup violence from a common ancestor who was already capable of it. On the other side, researchers like Brian Ferguson and Douglas Fry have argued with considerable force that the archaeological evidence for warfare in early human populations is actually quite thin. The skeletal evidence for organized lethal violence between human groups becomes much clearer and more consistent in the archaeological record after the development of agriculture, roughly 10,000 years ago. Before that, in the long Paleolithic period when our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, the evidence is sparse and ambiguous. This, in their view, suggests that warfare is not a deep evolutionary inheritance, but a relatively recent cultural development, one that emerged when human societies became settled, developed storable food surpluses, and had something concrete to defend and conquer. The truth, as is so often the case in complex evolutionary debates, probably lies somewhere between these two poles. The capacity for organized intergroup violence, the cognitive and motivational machinery that makes it possible, does appear to be ancient and shared with our closest relatives. But capacity is not the same as inevitability. A musical instrument has the capacity to produce sound, but it does not spontaneously play itself. The ecological and social conditions that activate the capacity for warfare, conditions like resource scarcity, political instability, high male-to-female ratios, and the presence of vulnerable outgroup targets, are highly variable across time and across cultures. And the evidence from anthropology is that human societies have varied enormously in the extent to which they have engaged in organized violence, from highly warlike to extremely peaceful. What chimpanzees like those in Gombe show us is something specific and important. They show us that the specific behavioral sequence that constitutes lethal intergroup raiding, patrolling territory, seeking out isolated individuals from rival groups, and attacking them with coordinated group effort, does not require culture, language, weapons, or any of the specifically human social institutions we associate with warfare. It requires only social living, territory, competing groups, and a nervous system complex enough to recognize opportunities and execute plans. That combination is old, much older than humanity. But here is the crucial, the absolutely essential caveat. Humans are not chimpanzees. We share roughly 98.5% of our DNA with chimpanzees, which sounds like a lot until you consider that a 1.5% difference in the genome of a creature as complex as a primate translates into extraordinary differences in cognition, language, culture, and social organization. We also share a substantial amount of our DNA with our other closest relative, the bonobo. And bonobos, who are equally closely related to us as chimpanzees are, have a remarkably different social organization. Bonobo societies are more egalitarian, female-dominated, and notably less prone to lethal intergroup violence. If we want to use our primate relatives as a mirror for understanding ourselves, we need to hold up both mirrors simultaneously. So, if the capacity for organized violence is ancient and not uniquely human, what is it that makes human warfare different from chimpanzee raiding parties? Because it is different, profoundly, qualitatively different. And understanding those differences is at least as important as understanding the similarities. The most obvious difference is scale. Chimpanzee intergroup violence is lethal and brutal, but it is also small. Gombe's war, horrifying as it was, involved dozens of animals and unfolded over 4 years. Human warfare has, at its worst, reshaped entire continents, killed tens of millions of people in a matter of years, and left scars in the landscape and the collective memory that persist for generations. The scale difference is not incidental. It is a consequence of specifically human cognitive and social capacities. Language allows us to coordinate action across time and space in ways that no chimpanzee can manage. Culture allows us to transmit knowledge about warfare, to build on the lessons of past conflicts, to develop technologies and tactics. Political organization allows us to mobilize resources and manpower at a scale that would be completely impossible in a chimpanzee community. The second crucial difference is ideology. Chimpanzees do not go to war for abstract reasons. They do not have religious crusades, ethnic hatreds, nationalist ideologies, or political philosophies. When a chimpanzee patrol kills a member of a neighboring group, it is acting on impulses rooted in territory, competition, and dominance. There is no story it is telling itself about why the other chimps deserve to die. There is no dehumanization, no propaganda, no doctrine of manifest destiny or racial purity. All of those specifically human additions to the basic primate template for intergroup violence are creations of human culture, and because they are cultural, they are, in principle, subject to cultural change. This is perhaps the most important insight that emerges from the comparison between chimpanzee violence and human warfare. The basic motivational and behavioral machinery may be ancient and shared, but the specific forms that human warfare takes, the specific ideologies that justify it, the specific social structures that organize it, the specific technologies that amplify it, all of these are human inventions, and inventions can be examined, critiqued, revised, and replaced. The primatologist Frans de Waal spent decades studying both chimpanzees and bonobos, and one of his central arguments is that we cannot understand our evolutionary heritage by focusing only on the violent side. Chimpanzees are capable of extraordinary empathy, reconciliation, consolation, and cooperation. They form deep, lasting friendships. They grieve their dead. In the Gombe story itself, one of the most haunting details is the image of Honeybee staying with her dying mother for 4 days, refusing to leave until Madame Bee passed away. That tenderness is as real as the violence. It is as ancient as the violence. It is as much a part of our evolutionary inheritance as the capacity for war. De Waal's point, and it is a powerful one, is that nature did not give us violence and culture gave us peace. Nature gave us both violence and the capacities for empathy, cooperation, and reconciliation, and culture has the power to amplify either one. The question is not whether we have a violent nature to overcome, but rather which parts of our very complex and contradictory nature we choose to cultivate, which we choose to constrain, and how we design our social institutions to do that work. The situation unfolding at Nogo in Uganda is significant not only because it may represent a second documented case of chimpanzee community fission accompanied by lethal violence, but also because of what it can potentially teach us about the mechanisms of these events. The scientific value of having two cases instead of one is difficult to overstate. With a sample size of one, you can describe what happened, but you cannot reliably identify the causes. With two cases, you can begin to look for common patterns, common precipitating factors, common sequences of social change that precede the violence. And already, some intriguing parallels are emerging. At Nogo, as at Gombe, the period leading up to the fission and violence was characterized by a disruption in the dominance hierarchy. A new alpha emerged shortly before the community began to fracture. At Nogo, as at Gombe, the subsequent violence has been largely one-directional, with one subcommunity taking on the offensive role while the other retreats and effectively ceases to contest its territory. These are not random details. They suggest that there may be a common underlying dynamic, a sequence of social destabilization that follows a predictable path once certain triggering conditions are met. What researchers like Aaron Sandell and his colleagues at Nogo are now doing is something that was not possible in the 1970s. They are watching the process unfold in near real time with the benefit of decades of accumulated methodological sophistication, genetic analysis tools, and a much deeper understanding of chimpanzee social structure than Goodall and her colleagues could have had at the time. The data they collect over the coming years could transform our understanding of not just chimpanzee violence, but the fundamental social dynamics that generate intergroup conflict in highly social animals. There is also something worth saying about the emotional and psychological experience of researchers who study this material. One of the things that comes through powerfully in conversations with primatologists who work at these sites is the difficulty of maintaining clinical detachment when the subjects of your research are animals as cognitively sophisticated, as socially complex, and frankly, as individually distinctive as chimpanzees. These researchers know these animals as individuals. They have names for them. They have watched them grow from infants to adults. They have tracked their friendships, their rivalries, their family relationships across years and decades. And then, they watch them kill each other. Richard Wrangham's observation that the Gombe attacks may actually have been slightly inhibited compared to killings he has documented elsewhere is one of the most thought-provoking pieces of data in this entire story. Every Kahama victim was still alive when their attackers left them. They crawled away and died of their injuries, sometimes days later, but they were not killed outright. At Kibale, where Wrangham has done much of his research, killings on the spot are the consistent pattern. Whether the relative restraint at Gombe reflects something about the prior social bonds between attacker and victim, whether some vestige of familiarity held back the final blow even as the attacks themselves were devastating, is a question that may never be fully answered, but it is a haunting one. We come now to the question that probably brought many of you to this topic in the first place. What does all of this mean for us? What does it mean for how we understand ourselves, our history, our societies, and our future? I want to be very direct about something here. The biology of violence is not a counsel of despair. The fact that the capacity for organized intergroup violence appears to have deep evolutionary roots does not mean that war is inevitable, does not mean it is natural in the sense of being morally acceptable, and does not mean that there is nothing we can or should do about it. These are logical fallacies that have sometimes been dressed up in the language of science, and they deserve to be firmly rejected. What the biology does tell us is something genuinely useful. It tells us that the motivational foundations of intergroup conflict are not going to be eliminated by simply telling people that war is bad, or by appealing to their reason, or by drawing up international treaties, powerful as those tools can be. If the impulses that underlie intergroup aggression are as old and as deeply embedded as the evidence suggests, then sustainable peace requires more than just the absence of a reason to fight. It requires actively cultivating the social conditions that keep those impulses dormant and the social institutions that channel competitive energy into non-violent forms. And here, the science of peace, which has developed considerably in recent decades, has important things to say. Research on successful peace-building across human societies consistently identifies a cluster of factors that reduce the likelihood of intergroup violence. Contact between groups under conditions of equal status and common goals reduces the psychological distance between in-group and out-group, making dehumanization harder to sustain. Economic interdependence, where groups need each other to flourish, creates strong incentives against violence. Strong and impartial institutions that can mediate disputes and enforce agreements remove the sense that violence is the only available remedy for grievances. And the expansion of the circle of moral concern, the gradual cultural process by which more and more people are included in the category of those whose welfare matters to us, has been one of the most powerful forces for peace in human history. None of these are magic solutions. Human history is full of examples where contact increased hostility rather than reducing it, where economic interdependence failed to prevent catastrophic wars, where institutions were captured and corrupted rather than serving as neutral arbiters. The path toward less violent human societies is not straight, not guaranteed, and not without setbacks. But it is a real path, and it is one that human beings have demonstrably made progress along, even if that progress is uneven and fragile. The philosopher and cognitive scientist Steven Pinker, in his deeply controversial but also deeply researched book on the decline of violence, argues that by almost every measurable metric, the per capita rate of violent death in human societies has declined dramatically over the long arc of history. He has faced significant criticism for this argument, and some of that criticism is well-founded. Statistics about violence are difficult to compile and easy to manipulate. The 20th century, the bloodiest in recorded history in absolute terms, complicates any simple narrative of progress, and the existence of nuclear weapons means that the potential for catastrophic violence has never been higher, even as the day-to-day rates have arguably fallen. But the core insight is worth taking seriously. Human beings have, in many parts of the world and across many centuries, found ways to reduce the violence in their societies. They have done this not by changing their biological nature, which evolution operates on timescales of thousands to millions of years, but by changing their social institutions, their cultural norms, their legal systems, and the stories they tell themselves about who belongs in their moral community. That is an enormous and genuinely hopeful finding, and it is one that the chimpanzees of Gombe, for all their capacity for violence, cannot share, because they lack what we have, the ability to look at what happened, to grieve it, to analyze it, and to ask with genuine urgency, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? We began this journey in Tanzania in 1974. With a young chimpanzee named Godi sitting alone in a tree eating fruit, about to be swarmed by attackers he probably knew. We have traveled from there through the neuroscience of aggression, through the evolutionary debate about the deep roots of war, through the social dynamics of community fission and collapse, through the emerging story at Ngogo, and through what all of this might mean for the most violent and the most peaceable species the planet has ever produced. What the Gombe chimpanzee war offers us is not a simple answer to the question of whether we are a violent species by nature. It offers us something more valuable than a simple answer. It offers us a mirror. And what you see when you look into that mirror depends enormously on what questions you are willing to ask. If you look only for the violence, you will find it. The attacks in Gombe were brutally efficient, systematically targeted, and carried out by individuals who had every reason to know better. who had grown up with their victims, played with them, groomed them, built a social world with them. There is something in that history that implicates something deep in primate social psychology, something that cannot be wished away or explained as an aberration. But if you look more carefully, you also find Honeybee. You find her sitting in that tree above her dying mother for 4 days, not leaving. You find the possibility that some of the Kasakela attackers held back, pulled their punches, fell short of the killing blow in a way that their counterparts at other sites apparently did not. You find the researchers themselves unable to remain fully detached, grieving the animals they had known and loved. You find the scientists at Nagogo today monitoring a WhatsApp group and hoping, genuinely hoping, that nobody dies. The capacity for empathy, for grief, for restraint, for asking what this violence means and whether it had to happen, these are also ancient. They are also ours. They are also something that the evidence suggests we share, in some form, with our closest relatives. And in humans, they have been elaborated, amplified, and institutionalized in ways that have no parallel in any other species. We are, without question, capable of terrible things. The long and bloody history of our species makes that abundantly clear. But we are also, uniquely among all the animals that have ever lived on this planet, capable of sitting down together after the violence, of reconstructing what happened and why, of building institutions designed to prevent it from happening again, and of writing long, searching, uncomfortable documents trying to understand our own nature well enough to transcend it. That is not a small thing. That may, in the end, be the most important thing. The Gombe-Chimpanzee War happened 50 years ago. The debates it generated are still live, still heated, still unresolved. And in a forest in Uganda right now, a group of researchers is watching another community of chimpanzees moving toward a confrontation that will either confirm or complicate everything we thought we knew. Whatever they find, it will matter, not just for primatology, for all of us. Because the question of why we fight and whether we have to is not an academic question. It is the question. And the forest, as it turns out, has been trying to answer it for a very long time.